Shout with joy to God all the earth.
Sing to the glory of his name.
Offer him glory and praise.
Sing to the glory of his
Sing
name.
to the glory.
Sing to the glory of his
Sing
name.
to the glory.
Sing to the glory of his name.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Devoratorium. My name is Darnay DeVore, and I'm going to be your host. On this episode, we'll be discussing the two Jerusalems. That's two Jerusalems. Which one of these Jerusalems are your home? Now, did you know the Bible actually does speak of two Jerusalems? Yeah, it's two locations. They share the same name, but they could not be more different and distinct from one another. In today's video, we're going to discuss both those Jerusalems, but we're going to start with the one that's not on the map. Okay, we all know where the physical one is that's on the map, but the one not on the map, yeah, we're going to start with that one. Okay, that's the fun one. It starts with Hebrews 11, 8 through 10. And reads, "By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God." You'll find this story originally in Genesis 12, starting with verse 1. But the writer of Hebrews is literally taking that story from Genesis chapter 12 and expanding on it. The author is giving us more insights and more depth to what was originally just a simple story. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, this is the promised land. This is the land of Canaan. Okay, this is, matter of fact, most of this verse is the land of Canaan until you get to the very last part. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. We know that God is not the architect or builder of the city of Canaan. That was already in existence, built by human hands. So that's not the city that's in view here. The city that's in view here is something else. So even though Abraham and his family were on their way to the promised land, Abraham saw a vision of something more, something else. And that something else is what we're going to touch on today. So in our Hebrews 11 verse, we read that this is a city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. We don't get much more description than that. But in Hebrews 12, 22 through 24, we get more description. It reads, "But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel." This, we finally have a name. This city is called Mount Zion, or the heavenly Jerusalem. This is the city of the living God. This is where God dwells. As well as God, you have Jesus. You have thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly. All right. You've got the righteous folks whose names are written in heaven. This is where it's happening. This is that second Jerusalem that Abraham saw in Genesis chapter 12. When you see a city like this or a destination like this, then anything on earth is now suddenly no big deal. When God said, "Abraham, get up, take your family and go to this promised land," but you also show him a glimpse of this city, this heavenly Jerusalem, this Mount Zion. Oh, I don't care where you want me to go here, God. I'll go here, there, anywhere is okay. Because I know the end goal. I see that even after we pass on, there's a goal. There's a city that we get. There's an inheritance. There's a promise that we're going to receive. And now that I've seen a glimpse of it, it's no big deal now. Suddenly it's no big deal to walk my family across miles and miles, okay, for years across a desert to go to some promised land. That's cool. And the promised land was a beautiful promised land. But Abraham saw something more, and that made everything worth it. During this time of the writing of the book of Hebrews, the Jews were under occupation of Rome. Rome was in charge, and they lived and died by the hand of Rome. The Jews were also under persecution from their own people because the Jews were split. There were those who decided to follow Jesus Christ and those who decided to stay with the old law. Well, the ones who decided to stay with the old law persecuted the ones who were following Christ. So these particular Jews that were following Christ, they were being persecuted on both sides. They've got Rome on one side and they've got their own people on the other side. It was a terrible time for them. But the only way they were able to get through this is through messages like this. In Hebrews 13, verse 14, it reads, For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. Once again, they were pointing ahead. Okay, the author of Hebrews is telling all these Jews, don't worry about what's going on now. There's a city yet to come. You may lose your home now. You may lose your garden, your job. You may lose your career. You may lose your family. You may even lose your life. There is nothing to be gained here. There is a city that is yet to come. And this message sustained the Christians for the first 300 years of Christianity because the persecution never stopped. It just kept going and going. And so in order to get through the day, they had to keep remembering this message here, that there's a city yet to come. All right. Don't fight over your home. Don't fight over your land. You know, this is my home. This is my land. You can't take this. And, oh, this was in our family for centuries. And none of that matters. There's a new Jerusalem that's coming. And if you focus on that, all this, we can let that go. It does not endure. How many nations on this earth that thought they were going to endure forever are no longer around? Think about ancient Egypt. They were the world power at one time, and they're gone as far as the world power goes. Think of ancient Babylon. Think of ancient Rome. All these major superpowers, they're gone. Okay? Nothing endures, but this New Jerusalem will endure. The Apostle Paul gives us a stark contrast between Jerusalem, the physical Jerusalem, and this new Jerusalem that is yet to come. We're going to take a look at that contrast, and while we do, I want you to keep asking yourself, which one do you want to be your home, your permanent home? We're going to find this in Galatians 4, 21 through 31. This is a story about Abraham and his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. You'll find this story originally in Genesis chapter 16. What Paul does is he takes that story from Genesis 16 and he opens it up more. He explains it in ways that we would not have been able to see before. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we are going to do bullet points for this verse. Verse 21 through 23. Abraham had two sons, one by their Egyptian slave Hagar, and the other by his wife Sarah, who was not a slave, but she's free. Hagar's son Ishmael was born of the flesh. Sarah's son Isaac was born because of a divine promise from God. Let me give you a little bit more background here. Abraham and Sarah, they're husband and wife. All right. God comes to them and they're in their 80s or 90s. They're old, and says, you guys are going to have a kid. You guys are going to have a son. Abraham and Sarah have never had children. Sarah is barren. There is no way, physically, biologically, scientifically, naturally, there's no way Abraham and Sarah can have a child together. Okay? Let's make sure we're clear on that. So God comes along and tells them, you're going to have a son. Sarah laughs, and it's hard for them to accept it because they are so old, and it's well known that Sarah is barren. But nonetheless, that's God's promise. You're going to have a son. Some years later, there's no kid. There's no son. So the idea pops into Sarah's head, well, maybe God meant my husband Abraham and Hagar or someone else. And, since Hagar is our servant, let's try with her. So Abraham agreed, and they have a child together. Abraham and Hagar have a child together. So that's a little bit of background of what's going on in this particular passage. The problem is that wasn't God's promise. God's promise was Abraham and Sarah would have a son. In verse 24 through 26, Paul says Hagar represents the covenant from Mount Sinai, whose children were born as slaves. Mount Sinai represents current physical Jerusalem. Sarah represents the new covenant of the promise, the Jerusalem above. So you have Hagar and Sarah representing two different Jerusalems. One is the physical one you can find on the map. The other Jerusalem, represented through Sarah, is the one that you can only find above, a spiritual Jerusalem in heaven. Verse 27, even though Hagar had a single child from Abraham, Sarah, who in this passage is the desolate woman, will have innumerable children through Abraham, but these will not be children of the flesh. They will be children of the promise that God gave Abraham and Sarah. Verse 28 through 31, Paul continues to tell us that Isaac was born through the promise of God. Ishmael, though, born of the flesh, mocked Isaac, who was born of the Spirit. You'll find that in Genesis 21, verse 9. Children of Abraham's flesh still mock children born of Abraham's promise. All believers in Christ are children of Abraham and Sarah, a child of promise, not a child of flesh. This further goes into what was going on at this time. There were the hardline Old Covenant Jews who were mocking these Jews who were putting their faith in Jesus Christ. Okay? Matter of fact, Paul used to be one of them. Before he was Paul, he was a man named Saul, and he was of the flesh. He was born of Abraham through the flesh, and he mocked and persecuted the children of the promise. We see that in Acts 9, 1 through 2, and Acts 22, 4 through 5. Once Paul converted to faith in Christ, that's when he became a direct descendant of Abraham through the promise, not through the flesh. That is irrelevant. Galatians 3 verse 29 confirms this. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. That's it. If you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's seed. In the past, Paul had rejected Christ, but he was still of the seed of Abraham, but he rejected Christ. So his ancestry to Abraham was irrelevant. Not until he followed Christ, not until he became a follower of Christ did he become the seed of Abraham that the Bible is talking about, and thus heirs according to that promise. So one Jerusalem is the physical Jerusalem. This is the Jerusalem that you can find on a map. It is earthly, and it's connected with slavery and hardship. The other Jerusalem is spiritual. It is the heavenly city. Do you want to know what it looks like? You want more description of what this heavenly city looks like? This new Jerusalem? Revelation 21, 1 through 4. It reads, Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Did you get this? The first heaven and the first earth had passed away. If you're looking for the earthly Jerusalem, the physical Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that you can find on a map, guess what? As it said earlier in Hebrews, it's not an enduring city. This place will not endure. This verse here says it's going to pass away. The first heaven and the first earth passed away. It's gone. You're holding on to a temporary thing if that's what you're holding on to. You want to hold on to something permanent, something eternal. You hold on to this second Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that's coming out of heaven, the Jerusalem where God dwells, the Jerusalem where thousands and thousands of angels are there. Okay? That's the Jerusalem that you want to belong to. So let me ask again, where do you want to live? Do you want to fight for the physical land of Israel, for an earthly Jerusalem that's going to fade away? It's going to be done away with. Or do you want to keep your eyes set on the heavenly Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that's built by God himself, the Jerusalem that cannot be taken away, the Jerusalem that will never have disease, pain, anguish, death? None of that is ever going to be allowed in this new Jerusalem. Here's the cool thing about this. As Christians, we have a dual citizenship. We have our citizenship here on earth, and that implies wherever you live, any state, city, country, wherever you live, that is one citizenship. Our second citizenship is in heaven, and we see that explained further in Philippians 3:20 through 21. But we only have dual citizenship for now. Ultimately, we're going to lose one of those citizenships. That's our earthly citizenship. We're going to die. But once we do, our second citizenship is now fully activated, and we get to live in this new Jerusalem for eternity with God. If you're not a Christian, think about this. If you're not a Christian, consider, where do you want to hang your hat? Where do you want your home to be? Do you want your home to be here in this temporary place that can be burned, destroyed, blown up, or taken from you? Or do you want your home to be in the eternal city, the city that if we keep our eyes on that place, if we keep our eyes there, everything else here, it's going to become secondary. It'll still be important, but not as important as we make it out to be. I want to encourage all of you, if you've only got one citizenship, and that's here on earth, consider this second citizenship, okay? The promises outdo anything you can find here. I want to thank everybody for joining me today. Stay tuned for the next video.